Well, we're going to kick straight off with the Challenger tanks because, of course, according to the British government, 14 Challenger tanks sent to Ukraine are going to transform the war. And I encourage people, excuse me, to go to the British Army Twitter page because you will see that more or less anything to do with our national defence has now disappeared because we're in partnership with Ukraine. But aside from the tank saga, do also look out for the vast amount of what I will call woke agenda, which is clearly dominating British Army policy. And my reasons for that will become clear in just a second. But we'll remind ourselves with Mike's excellent slides that the reality is that the UK and the West are sending too few tanks of too many different types too late. And of course, a key point with the Challenger tanks is aside from anything, they use different ammunition to the Leopard tanks. So this will give the Ukrainians a further headache in how they actually keep these tanks supplied with ammunition. But let's remind ourselves also that the reality is that on the battlefield, Ukraine has lost thousands, literally thousands of tanks, and particularly the infantry fighting vehicles. I've just taken some slides here to emphasize the point. But of course, the reality is what is going to happen with the UK and US and NATO supplied infantry fighting vehicles that are already moving into Ukraine. These are also going to be destroyed. And there are plenty of pictures on social media to show the carnage on the battlefield as a result of the destruction of these very lightweight vehicles, which are vulnerable to Russian artillery and also Russian air power. So this is the tragic reality. More Ukrainians are going to die in these vehicles because they don't have the full range of battlefield assets to be fighting the Russians. Scrapyards full of vehicles. Of course, none of this is shown on the BBC, but of course the reality is that social media is now covering for the mainstream media. But we've also now got the situation where Russia has put in more tanks, thousands of Russian tanks on the battlefield with hundreds more pouring in because Russia has the capability to produce and transport these tanks. And of course, these tanks are now making life for the exposed Ukrainian troops truly horrible. And of course, the Russians are able to bring in modern tanks such as the T-90 breakthrough tank, aside from upgraded older models, which they're able to produce in very large numbers because the Russian economic base and the military industrial base is still performing exceptionally well. But we've got some things beginning to happen in Ukraine, which I think we need to pay attention to. We've had a Ukrainian presidential advisor resigning, and this was over some comments that he made in relation to the attack on the building block in Dnipro. And what happened there was a missile struck the building and at least 41 civilians died. This was quickly blamed purely on the Russians. But let's have, oh, sorry, we've just got a little bit out of sequence here. Let me see whether I can bring that back on screen. Yes, here we are. So this gentleman, Arestovich, said that the Ukrainian anti-aircraft defense system had shot down a Russian Kh-22 missile, and that subsequently hit the building, killing 41 civilians. But very quickly, he was censored and his statement changed to this: I offer my sincere apologies to the victims and their relatives, the residents of Dnipro, and everyone who was deeply hurt by my, quote, prematurely erroneous version of the reason for the Russian missile striking a residential building. So if you get close to the truth in the BBC's Ukraine, you're going to be censored and you're going to be moved on. But we've got more events today, which I think are significant, tragic, but significant. So this is the BBC headline: Who was Interior Minister Denis Monastyrsky? You'll have to correct me on that, Alex, struggling a bit on that one. But the reality is a helicopter crash near Kiev, and we've got more Ukrainian officials who've now died, and these are key people around Zelensky. So this is the report on it, that he'd been a long-term member of the Ukrainian government. He'd become the country's interior minister in July 2021. And it said he initially pursued a legal career in private practice, but then he entered politics, and he was part of the team behind Zelensky's successful, quote, long shot bid for the presidency in 2019. So key people here, but of course another man was killed alongside him, Enin, a former intelligence officer and a top lawyer who'd been in post since September 2021. So Alex, I'll just come across to you and say that it's clear that all is not going well around Zelensky at the moment. He's had a lot of conflict with his top military advisors. He seems to be able to override them, and this is largely shown by the fact that he's committing more and more troops to unsustainable positions in the Donbass. But it seems to me some cracks appearing. What's your opinion?
I think that this morning's crash is a crushing blow for Ukraine. Very underreported in the West is that it was such a sudden loss of control by the helicopter pilots that they crashed sadly directly onto a kindergarten. There's reports of 20 dead on the ground. Horrific enough as that is, as you've already mentioned, along with Monastyrsky has died reportedly his first deputy, and he was the man who understood how the ministry worked, being a lawyer and spook by background, Mr. Yevhen. So I'm not suggesting there's no talent pool in Ukraine, quite the opposite. Indeed, within the interior minister, they will manage to fill it again. But it will be a massive loss of continuity in the government. And you're quite right to suggest that the discontent is spreading. The mayor of Kiev has been one of the most outspoken of questioners of Zelensky's policy. General Zaluzhny has also had repeated run-ins with him. We'll be seeing more of this going on, I'm afraid. You mentioned the tanks as well. There's a lot of discontent within Western allies. Germany in particular. You've mentioned the British risible contribution of 14 tanks. There is also the German Leopard tanks, some of which are owned and operated by Poland and Finland, and I think France, I'm not definitive on that, on behalf of the German Bundeswehr. Germany still has to give permission for those, for example, from Poland or Finland, to be moved to Ukraine while the Germans are still debating whether to supply their own. They will still need to give permission, and we had the ridiculous spectacle of Ben Wallace, the British Secretary of State for War, standing up in Parliament just yesterday and saying, I beg my German colleagues to reconsider their objection. I know they're having a debate on whether tanks are lethal aid, but they're not, because if you use them to defend your country, then tanks are not an offensive weapon. Such is the disconnect that's going on now. As for Arestovich, this is the man who, well in advance of the war, said that the price of Ukraine's entry into NATO would be a war with Russia. We've featured that clip before. At another time, he praised the sort of steampunk aesthetic of Ukrainian military engagement with Russia, and said that this was something that would take the world to a new stage. I'm paraphrasing, but he was sort of slavering over the imagery of war. So he's had a long history of talking nonsense there. And I think we're about to move on to the German.
Well, before you do, Alex, I just wanted to check this point with you again, because last week when it was still pretty unclear what Britain was going to do with respect to tanks, the Polish government, and we covered this on this programme, the Polish government were absolutely definitive. We are sending Leopard tanks. But it turns out that actually they had no right to make that statement because those tanks, they had no permission.
From the
Correct.
Germans.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is the bilateral kind of stuff that we have, particularly you, Mike, have been focusing on for 4 or 5 years now. Britain-Poland, Britain-Germany, but also Germany-Poland. Bilateral agreements always, or almost always, include a stipulation, even in the old Franco-German joint battalion that used to be there for symbolic purposes, that the troops and their equipment, the men and the material, remained under the command of their National Ministry of Defence. So that the Poles should have known better than that. But meanwhile, the Ukrainians were getting extremely excited and saying, we're going to get German tanks from Poland before we get them from Germany. Can you imagine? Well,
Yeah.
Germany seems to be putting the brakes on that, and Wallace was left hopping mad and talking nonsense about tanks not being offensive weapons.
Yes, it's incredible, isn't it? Well, we gave you a little preview of this slide, which we did have up a couple of days ago, but let's just remind people that, of course, in Germany, big problems over the whole subject of tanks, and we had Christine Lambrecht resigning, and her position was described as a poison chalice or the ejector seat. And we said, well, what's going to happen is that they need warhawks to come in and fill those positions. But Alex, take us on to matters to do with the Ukraine Defence Contract Group.
Certainly, and just en passant regarding Mrs. Lambrecht's successor, who was the Interior Ministry of the state of Lower Saxony, Chancellor Olaf Scholz has rather tellingly said yesterday that his new appointee, he is certain will be somebody who's popular with the troops. Methinks there's possibly a hint there that there was an acknowledgement that Mrs. Lambrecht wasn't. The UK column Chatbox decided to dub her last time we featured her Fräulein Doubtfire, which is perhaps a bit unkind, but maybe accurate too. Now, for this, we had to go to the Azerbaijan press agency, their slogan, Kheberi Mizvar, we've got news, because they picked up on what seems to now be a dead link from Ukrinform, the Ukrainian state press agency of Soviet vintage. They had picked up that there was going to be another meeting in the format known as the Ukraine Defence Contact Group. That's the defence ministers for war, to be more accurate, for over 50 countries, and it's also known as the Rammstein format. So this is much broader than NATO or the EU. This is every partner wishing to supply Ukraine with arms in some way or training in some way or another. This is anodyne enough that the defence ministers, including Lambrecht before she was kicked out or jumped before she was pushed, talking to Lloyd Austin, her Pentagon counterpart, and coordinating the supply of infantry fighting vehicles, as you covered. However, and I don't have a slide for this, but for a very good reason, I'm now hearing from, I shall say, a diplomatic source at an international body with good knowledge of the subject, that much less advertised was yesterday, the 17th of January, there was also a meeting of the national armaments controllers. Those are the beam counters at the national defence ministers who know how many of each kind of rocket and tank there is to spare. And that this was deliberately not publicised. Also, I'm hearing that some EU member states are getting very cold feet about the idea of a push by Zelensky's team, not by Ukraine, but by Zelensky. You've already highlighted there's a split growing between Zelensky and the more military men. Zelensky's idea was to warm over his 10-point peace plan originally presented to the G20 at Bali just before Christmas, on the anniversary of the outbreak of the war on the 24th of February. However, I'm told that EU member states didn't like the idea. They were telling Zelensky to go back to the drawing board, get more pointed about it, make it more rhetorical, and more particularly, give European countries more pickings, give them more financial spoils. Otherwise, they wouldn't go for this, what the Americans would call a pork barrel. It's showing once again, and we're going to lead into more proof of this just now, that the West is egging on the Ukrainians more than the Ukrainians, even their own Ministry of Interior and Security and War Ministry themselves want. So we have just published, it was still in draft when Mike took this screenshot, but it is now live on ukcolumn.org, a full translation of a long piece by Colonel Jacques Beau, whose history is on the page itself and also on the red name link if you click on that, a former Swiss colonel with a specialism in Warsaw Pact countries and a well-known commentator, increasingly in English as well now, on the war. His piece is entitled The Search for Peace. It has opinion, but it is largely an article because there's so many well-made assertions with links in it. So we've published it as an article. And I think Mike has got a quotation from the end. Here we are. Just after he said that Ukraine is suffering because of our smug and clueless press in the West, and if it's true for Switzerland, how much more true it is of the British press, and he does zoom in on the sun at some point. Jacques Baud says this, and he's talking about the collective West from the perspective of a neutral Swiss, although he deplores that the Swiss are no longer properly neutral. He says, for Ukraine to gain victory, it does not suffice to kid ourselves that Ukraine is winning. Since March 2022, our media have been proclaiming Slava Ukraini, Russia's defeat, Russia's collapse, its isolation, and the imminent downfall of Vladimir Putin. None of this has happened, and I pause here to say we get flack for being Putin fanboys, but we and Baud, whom we have gladly translated here, do say, including in this piece, that the Russians have made mistakes, that they do bear responsibility for their actions, etc. Baud continues, Our media are engaging in wishful thinking. That's an English phrase that has traveled the length of the continent, so he uses it in the original German as an English phrase. Wishful thinking in our media to satisfy their need for hatred. The reality is different. The inability of European diplomacy to assert itself other than through arms supplies and sanctions, our differing treatment of this conflict compared to previous conflicts, and the condescending signalling towards Africa, largely about them not playing ball on sanctions, have discredited the old continent, of which the Swiss are perhaps the purest representatives, and breathed new life into Eurasia, whose main players are China, India, and Russia. We have failed utterly. I can just say, go and read this piece because it contains things I wasn't even aware of regarding just how jingoistic some of the presidential party has been in Ukraine, how much they have regarded their own people in the East as Untermenschen, and how much the chickens are coming home to roost. Bode is a deeply humanitarian man, and he deplores all the violence. He's not saying in any way serve the Ukrainians right. He's even acknowledging that the Swiss ambassador in Kiev has every right to stand up for the Ukrainians after they've been invaded. It's just how we've gone about it and our own perception of the causes of the conflict which is at fault.
And if I may, and I think a key question is the we. Who actually are we talking about? Are we talking about policy from nation states, the British government, or are we talking about policies cooked up elsewhere?
Good question. But Alex, we should just we should just mention that translation is with permission.
Yes, it's been first appeared in German courtesy of Zeitgeschehen im Fokus, and by editorial permission of them, we have translated it into English, and we've mentioned that at the head of the piece. And Zeitgeschehen im Fokus is now going to carry, I'm told, the English translation that I've made on their own website.
Okay, thank you for that.